It was Christmas night, the kind of cold that makes cities feel hollow. Traffic slowed, lights blurred, and a veteran driving home from a charity shift thought the hardest part of the day was over, until his K9 partner stopped him cold. Not barking, not panicking, just standing still, listening. What he heard wasn't danger. It was desperation that on a frozen bus bench sat two elderly strangers, shaking beneath thin coats, waiting for a son who had already chosen money over mercy. This isn't a story about coincidence. It's about choice. About the family we protect when our own turns away. Before the storm deepens, drop your country in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe that love, not blood, is what makes a family, subscribe now. Because this quiet miracle begins right here.
Christmas Eve pressed down on the city with a brittle cold. Street lights haloed in pale ice, breath turning to smoke, as the temperature hovered near 5 degrees Celsius. Daniel Carter eased his pickup through the downtown grid, tires whispering over salted asphalt. At 42, he carried the quiet density of a man who had learned to compress emotion into function. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a squared posture that never softened, even out of uniform. A short, dark beard traced his angular jaw, framing a face marked by sharp cheekbones and a nose that had once been broken and set imperfectly. His hair, cropped close, had begun to gray at the temples. Daniel's eyes were steady but distant, the look of someone who had seen too much and learned to keep it behind his teeth. Years in the U.S. Army had trained him to act first and feel later. Since leaving the service, he lived alone in a small apartment and volunteered relentlessly, as if motion itself could keep the past from catching up. That evening, he had just finished a late shift delivering gifts and warm meals to a nursing home as part of a veterans' Christmas outreach. He stayed longer than required, helping residents open packages, listening to stories told slowly and repeated without apology. When he finally left, the truck bed was empty, the work complete. He took a familiar route toward the supply depot to return borrowed equipment, skirting the central bus station to avoid traffic. Rex rode in the passenger seat. The retired German Shepherd was 8 years old, his once black muzzle now flecked with gray. His sable coat was thick and well kept, his frame powerful but disciplined. Rex had been trained as a canine overseas, and though officially retired, he still carried himself like he was on duty. Calm, alert, deeply observant, Rex rarely made unnecessary noise. Daniel had adopted him after the dog's handler was killed in combat. They had recognized something familiar in each other: loss without spectacle, loyalty without condition. As the truck slowed near the bus station, Rex suddenly stiffened. It was a subtle change, but Daniel noticed immediately. The dog's ears angled forward, his body leaning toward the windshield, muscles tight. Daniel felt the old instinct rise in his chest and eased off the gas. Following Rex's line of sight, he saw them. An elderly couple sat on a metal bench just outside the station doors. They looked impossibly small against the concrete and glass. The man appeared tall even while seated, his frame thin, shoulders rounded with age. His hair was white and closely cut, his face deeply lined, suggesting decades of physical labor. He wore a heavy coat draped protectively around the woman beside him, leaving himself exposed in a faded flannel shirt. The woman was petite, her posture folded inward, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Wisps of white hair escaped from beneath a knitted hat, and her skin had taken on a pale, unhealthy hue. 2 old suitcases sat at their feet, scuffed and taped at the corners, as if they had been carried for far longer than intended. Daniel parked and approached slowly. "Evening," he said, careful not to startle them. "You folks okay?" The man looked up, his eyes guarded but polite. "We're fine," he said quickly. The woman leaned closer to him, shivering. Daniel nodded, taking in the signs his training had taught him to read. "It's cold to be sitting out here." "We're waiting," the woman said softly. "Our son is coming to get us." Rex stepped closer without being prompted, sitting beside the woman and pressing gently against her leg. She hesitated, then rested her hand on his head. "Such a good dog," she whispered. Daniel noticed the woman's trembling hands, the stiffness in her movements, the way her lips trembled as much from cold as emotion. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Since this morning," she said. The man hesitated, then corrected quietly, "Since 5:30. Daniel glanced at his watch. Night had fallen hours ago. He offered to get them something warm from a nearby cafe, but they refused, fearful of moving in case their son arrived while they were gone. Daniel straightened, uncertainty tightening his shoulders. There were systems for this, numbers he could call, procedures he could follow. He told himself he couldn't fix everything. He turned back toward his truck. Rex did not follow. Instead, the dog rose and released a single low bark, short, controlled, unmistakable. A warning Daniel had not heard in years. He stopped mid-step and turned back. Rex held his gaze, eyes focused, ears rigid, body angled toward the couple. Daniel exhaled slowly and faced the bench again. Daniel stopped beside the bench, the cold biting through his jacket, as if the night wanted its say. Up close, the couple looked even more fragile, time having thinned them to essentials. The man straightened slightly, pride reflexively lifting his chin. He introduced himself as Walter, his voice steady, Midwestern, the kind that once commanded a room without raising volume. He was tall, despite the stoop, all angles softened by age, with hands that bore the faint calluses of a lifetime of work. His eyes were sharp but tired, the gaze of someone who had learned to ration hope. The woman beside him was Margaret. She was smaller, bird-like, her skin pale against the wool of her coat, her hair white and fine, pinned neatly but loosening strand by strand. Her eyes were kind and unfocused at once, as if warmth had begun to drift just beyond reach. She smiled at Daniel with a courtesy learned long ago, then shivered again, a tremor she tried and failed to hide. "We didn't want to bother anyone," Walter said, as if that explained everything. "Kevin said he'd be here." Daniel nodded, listening more than speaking. He asked questions the way medics did, simple, practical, non-judgmental. What time had they arrived? 5:30 that morning, Margaret answered, certain and proud of the detail. The night bus had been late. They'd gotten off stiff and sore, but relieved, believing the hard part was over. Walter added that they'd stayed put because Kevin had told them to wait at the station, that it would be easier to find them there. Daniel glanced at the clock mounted above the glass doors. 6 hours had passed since daylight surrendered. The wind slipped between buildings and settled on the bench like a weight. A bus station employee had come by earlier, Walter said. A young woman with a knit cap pulled low and a clipboard hugged to her chest. She'd asked if they needed help, offered to call someone. They'd declined politely, insisting their son was minutes away. Daniel pictured the exchange and understood how it had gone. Concern met by certainty, procedure yielding to belief. The employee had done what she could within the narrow lane of her job, then moved on. Margaret's breathing was shallow now, each inhale a small effort. Her lips had gone faintly blue. Daniel felt the familiar click inside his chest, the one that sorted emotion from action. He knelt to her level, keeping his voice even. "Ma'am, "You're cold," he said. "I can get you somewhere warm across the street. Coffee, soup. We'd be back before you know it." She shook her head, eyes widening with fear. "If he comes and we're not here—" Rex pressed closer, his body a steady heat against her leg. The dog's ears flicked, his nose working the air, and he let out a soft huff. Daniel recognized the behavior. Rex did it when someone's balance tipped toward danger. The dog's gaze moved between Margaret's face and Daniel's, insistence without panic. Walter noticed, too. He put a hand on Margaret's shoulder, his own fingers numb and red. "Maybe just a minute," he said, trying to sound convincing. Margaret's jaw trembled, and she nodded once, reluctantly. Daniel stood, scanning for a cafe sign he'd seen earlier. The wind gusted again, and Margaret swayed. Rex shifted his weight, bracing her. Daniel caught her elbow in time, feeling how light she was, how easily the night might take her if it wanted. He cursed quietly, not at them, not at the cold, but at the thinness of the line between faith and folly. "I'm not asking any more," he said gently, the way he'd spoken to frightened soldiers and stubborn elders alike. "We're moving." Walter hesitated, then nodded. Pride loosened its grip. As they rose, Margaret leaned into Rex without realizing it, her hand sliding into the fur at his neck, as if it had always belonged there. Daniel guided them a few steps toward the curb, then paused when Margaret whispered Kevin's name again, a question shaped like a prayer. They sat back down, breaths ragged, the moment passing like a wave that hadn't broken yet. Daniel stayed with them, the decision forming even as he resisted it. He asked Walter about the suitcases, how long they'd been traveling, what they'd brought. Walter's mouth tightened. "Just what we needed," he said too quickly. "Clothes, papers." Daniel waited. Silence did its work. Walter exhaled, a sound that carried weeks of weight. "He sold the house," he said at last, voice low. 3 months ago." The words hung there, stark and heavy. Daniel didn't interrupt. He watched Margaret, who stared ahead as if the bench had become a horizon. Walter went on, haltingly, explaining that Kevin had told them it was temporary, that downsizing would be easier, that family would take care of family. The sale had happened fast. The money had gone somewhere else. Kevin had promised space in his place once things settled. Tonight was supposed to be the settling. Rex lifted his head and looked at Walter, then at Daniel, as if confirming what the night had been trying to say all along. Daniel felt the shape of the problem sharpen. This wasn't a missed pickup. It wasn't confusion. It was abandonment dressed up as logistics. Walter leaned closer to Daniel, his voice barely above the wind. "We didn't want to tell her," he said, nodding toward Margaret. "She still believes he's coming." Daniel swallowed. The cold felt different now, less like weather and more like a test. He stayed with them, the bench no longer just a bench, the night no longer just a night. The city moved on around them, buses arriving and leaving, doors sliding open and shut. But Daniel did not. He had learned long ago what happened when you left people where you found them. Margaret's knees buckled without warning, a quiet collapse that might have gone unnoticed if Rex had not already surged to his feet. The dog's body snapped into motion, muscles locking, a sharp bark cutting through the wind, not loud, not frantic, but precise, the kind of sound that once preceded incoming danger. Daniel moved at the same instant, instinct overriding doubt. He caught Margaret under the arms as she sagged, her weight lighter than it should have been, her breath fluttering against his sleeve like a trapped bird. Up close, Her skin felt cold through the fabric, an unnatural chill that training manuals warned about. Her eyes struggled to focus, lids heavy, lips trembling as if words were trying and failing to form. Walter reached for her, panic breaking through his restraint, his long fingers shaking as he steadied her shoulders. For a brief second, the bench, the station, the passing buses blurred into irrelevance. Daniel had seen this moment before, on cold mornings in places without names, when hesitation turned manageable risk into loss. "We're leaving," Daniel said, not loudly, not angrily, but with finality. He did not ask permission. He shifted Margaret's weight against him and nodded to Walter. "Now." Walter hesitated, pride warring with fear, then nodded once. The decision carved itself into his posture. Rex pressed close to Margaret's side, offering balance and warmth, his flank a living brace. Together they moved toward the curb, the cold biting harder with each step. Margaret murmured something Daniel couldn't catch, her voice slurring at the edges. He guided her into the back seat of the truck, wrapping a blanket from behind the seat around her shoulders. Walter climbed in beside her, coat still draped around her frame, his jaw clenched as if holding the world together by force of will. Daniel slid into the driver's seat, heart thudding, and pulled away from the curb. The city lights streaked past, the station shrinking in the rearview mirror. Rex settled on the floor between the seats, head up, eyes never leaving Margaret. The heater roared to life, hot air filling the cab, and Daniel watched color inch back into her cheeks. "Kevin's coming, isn't he?" Margaret asked suddenly, her voice small and hopeful. She turned toward Daniel, searching his face. "He said he'd come." Daniel met her gaze through the mirror and swallowed. "We're getting you somewhere warm," he said carefully. "That's what matters right now." She nodded, satisfied for a moment, then frowned. "But if we're not there—" The thought slipped away, leaving confusion in its wake. She looked at Walter. "Did I forget something?" Walter took her hand, his thumb tracing circles into her skin. "No," he said, too quickly. "You're fine." His voice broke on the last word. They drove in silence for several blocks, the heater working, the city settling into a muted holiday hush. Margaret asked again, softly, "Kevin's coming?" The question returned like a tide, predictable and relentless. Daniel felt the weight of it settle into his chest. He had known men who repeated coordinates under fire, minds looping when the world became too much. He recognized the signs now with a different kind of ache. Walter cleared his throat. "He called," he said, staring straight ahead. The words came slowly, as if each one had to be pried loose. "Early this morning. Said he couldn't do it anymore." He paused, breath hitching. "Said we should find somewhere else." Daniel's grip tightened on the wheel. He said nothing, letting the road and the heater carry them forward. "He said it would be temporary," Walter went on, voice rough. "That selling the house would make things easier, that we'd stay with him for a bit." He laughed once, a sound without humor. 42 years in that house. I fixed the roof myself. Built the porch when Margaret wanted a place to sit." He shook his head. "Gone." Margaret leaned against him, eyes half closed, the warmth finally taking hold. "Kevin will be mad if we're not there," she murmured. Walter kissed her hair, his eyes wet but steady. "I know." Daniel drove, the decision settling into his bones. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't a missed connection or a bad day. It was a line drawn and crossed. He thought of the words drilled into him long ago, words that had followed him out of uniform and into quieter battles. No one left behind. They had been simple once, a rule as clear as gravity. Life had complicated them. Tonight, stripped them back down again. He pulled into a small gas station parking lot, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. He cut the engine, but left the heater running, stepping out into the cold to clear his head. Rex followed, standing at his side, breath fogging the air. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath fur. "This isn't an accident," Daniel said softly, more to himself than to Rex. He looked back at the truck, at Walter bent protectively over Margaret. The truth settled with a quiet certainty. Someone had chosen convenience over care. Someone had decided that blood was a contract they could void. Daniel opened the driver's door again. "We're going to my place," he said, calm and firm. "Just for tonight. We'll figure out the rest in the morning." Walter looked at him, really looked at him, and nodded. Gratitude flickered there, tangled with shame and relief. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate and necessary all at once. As Daniel pulled back onto the road, the city opening ahead of them, he understood the shape of the night. This wasn't a detour. It was a line he would not uncross. Daniel's apartment sat on the third floor of a brick building that had seen better decades, its stairwell smelling faintly of old paint and winter coats. He unlocked the door and stepped aside, ushering Walter and Margaret in, as if crossing a threshold required ceremony. "Just for tonight," he said, the boundary spoken aloud to make it real. The living room was small and orderly, the kind of space shaped by one occupant who valued calm over decoration. A couch faced a low table, scarred by use. Shelves held neatly aligned books, and near the window stood an old Christmas tree, real, modest, and uneven, strung with white lights that hummed softly. Daniel had brought it home days earlier and set it up without thinking much about why. Margaret stopped at the doorway. The warmth caught her first, then the lights did. Her breath hitched, eyes filling as she reached out, fingertips hovering just short of the needles, as if afraid they might vanish. "It's Christmas," she whispered, surprised by her own certainty. Her voice steadied, memory sharpening around the glow. Walter stood behind her, his shoulders easing for the first time that night. He took in the room with a craftsman's eye, noting the clean lines, the absence of clutter, the careful way Daniel had arranged a life meant to hold only one. Daniel helped Margaret out of her coat and guided her to the couch, placing a blanket over her lap. He moved with the practiced gentleness of someone used to carrying weight without ceremony. Rex padded through the apartment, nails clicking softly, then stationed himself at the hallway entrance, body angled toward the guest room as if already assigned. His eyes tracked every movement, calm and vigilant, a soldier who understood watch without being told. Walter sat beside Margaret, his hand finding hers. "You should rest," he said. She nodded, already leaning back, the heat working its quiet mercy. Daniel fetched water and a bowl of soup warmed on the stove, setting them within easy reach. Margaret ate slowly, color returning to her cheeks, pausing now and then to look at the tree again, each glance a small miracle. "We didn't have one last year," she said, then frowned, uncertain. "Or maybe we did." She smiled anyway, the smile landing where the truth mattered less than the feeling. Daniel retrieved the boxes he'd left by the door, gifts meant for the nursing home residents he'd visited earlier. He hesitated, then carried them into the living room. "These were supposed to go somewhere else," he said, not apologizing. He set a wrapped scarf in Margaret's hands, a pair of gloves in Walter's. Walter turned the gloves over, studying the stitching, like a man reacquainting himself with dignity. "You didn't have to," he said, voice low. Daniel shrugged. "I did." The evening settled into a gentle rhythm. Walter talked quietly about the house he'd built years ago, the porch, the roof, the smell of sawdust in summer. Daniel listened, asking only when invited. He noticed how Walter's sentences grew shorter when Margaret drifted, how he softened his tone without thinking. When Margaret dozed, her breathing even, Daniel guided Walter to the guest room and showed him where towels were stacked, where the light switch sat. "I'll take the couch," Daniel said, already decided. Walter shook his head once, grateful and exhausted, and closed the door with care. Rex lay down across the hallway threshold, head on his paws, eyes open. Daniel dimmed the lights and sat on the couch, the tree's glow pooling at his feet. The quiet pressed in, not empty, but full. He thought of nights when quiet had meant danger, when stillness preceded noise that never left. Tonight it meant safety, however temporary. He checked his phone and saw the hour slip toward midnight. A notification chimed, sharp in the calm. Daniel glanced down, expecting a benign alert. Instead, an email sat unread. Sender unknown. Subject line, blunt. He opened it. The message was short, clinical, stripped of warmth. A warning that retaining elderly individuals without authorization could constitute unlawful detention. A suggestion to correct the situation promptly. No signature, no contact number. The words were chosen to frighten without revealing a hand. Daniel read it twice, jaw tightening. He looked down the hallway where Rex kept watch, then toward the guest room door. The boundary he'd set, just for tonight, felt suddenly fragile. He closed the email and locked his phone, slipping it face down onto the table. The tree lights reflected faintly on the screen, like distant stars. He rose and moved quietly to the hallway, lowering himself to the floor beside Rex. The dog shifted, pressing his shoulder into Daniel's knee, solid and warm. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's neck and breathed, the way he'd learned to do when a situation turned from simple to complex. The apartment held its breath with him, walls absorbing the night. In the guest room, Walter murmured in his sleep. Margaret turned, sighed, and settled. The house remained quiet, quiet enough to hear the truth forming, quiet enough to feel the cost of doing the right thing. Daniel stared at the closed door, the email's words echoing without sound, and understood that this night had already asked more of him than he'd planned to give. 2 days after Christmas, the knock came in the late afternoon, firm but measured, the sound of someone who expected the door to open. Daniel was at the kitchen counter, rinsing a mug, when Rex lifted his head. The dog didn't bark. He stood, slow and deliberate, ears forward, eyes fixed on the door. Daniel wiped his hands and moved to the entry, posture settling into that familiar, squared readiness he rarely noticed anymore. Kevin stood in the hallway, under the fluorescent lights, dressed as if for a meeting rather than a visit. He was in his late 40s, tall and lean, with a careful build, his hair dark and neatly combed back, a hint of gray at the temples that looked curated rather than earned. His jaw was clean-shaven, his smile practiced, pleasant, professional, empty of warmth. His eyes flicked past Daniel into the apartment, assessing, cataloging. He smelled faintly of cologne and winter air. "Daniel Carter," Kevin said, extending a hand. "Kevin Morris. I believe we need to talk." Daniel did not take the hand. He shifted half a step, blocking the view down the hall. "About?" Kevin's smile tightened. My parents. From the living room, Margaret's voice floated in, soft and uncertain. Daniel? She was seated on the couch, a scarf draped over her shoulders, her hair brushed neatly by Walter's careful hands. When she saw Kevin step into view, recognition cut through the haze like light through glass. Her face crumpled. Kevin, she said, standing too quickly. You came. She crossed the room with small, urgent steps, reaching for him. Kevin held his ground. She stopped inches away, eyes shining. You left us, she said, the words tumbling out. It was so cold. Kevin's expression shifted, not to anger, but to something cooler. Mom, he said gently, turning his palms outward as if calming a child. You're confused. We talked about this. Walter rose from his chair, his height filling the space without effort. His shoulders were straight, his coat buttoned, his face set in a way Daniel hadn't seen before. Don't, Walter said. One word, heavy as iron. Kevin glanced at him, then back to Daniel. This is inappropriate, he said, voice still polite. You have no authority to keep them here. My mother has a condition. She misremembers things. I'm concerned about undue influence. Daniel felt the familiar heat behind his sternum. He stepped forward, placing himself between Kevin and the couch where Margaret stood, trembling. They came here because they were in danger, he said evenly. It was 5 degrees. Your mother was hypothermic. Kevin sighed, the sound carefully pitched for reasonableness. I appreciate your concern, truly, but this crosses a line. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. I've been advised that retaining elderly individuals without consent can have legal implications. Margaret shook her head, tears spilling. You told us to wait, she said. You said you were coming. Kevin turned to her, voice softening. Mom, you remember it that way because you were scared. Walter stepped closer to Margaret, placing an arm around her shoulders. His voice, when it came, was steady but hoarse. You called me, he said. At dawn. You said you couldn't do it anymore. Kevin's jaw tightened just enough to betray him. I said I couldn't manage everything alone, he replied. There's a difference. Rex moved then, placing himself at Daniel's side, body angled toward Kevin. He did not growl, he did not bare his teeth. He simply stood, a quiet wall of muscle and intent. Daniel held Kevin's gaze. You don't get to rewrite what happened, he said. Not here. Kevin exhaled through his nose, patience thinning. This is exactly what I mean, he said. You're escalating. My parents will be coming with me. Margaret clutched Walter's coat. I don't want to go, she whispered. Kevin's eyes flicked to Daniel again, irritation surfacing. You're coercing them. No, Walter said. He straightened, every line of him sharpening. You did. The room stilled. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to recede. Walter's hand tightened at Margaret's shoulder, grounding her. You sold the house without telling her, he continued. You moved the money where you thought I wouldn't find it. You told us to wait like luggage. Kevin's composure cracked. That's not... And you didn't get all of it, Walter said quietly. Kevin stopped. The silence stretched, taut as wire. What? Walter met his son's eyes without flinching. I kept a separate savings account, he said. One you don't control. The color drained from Kevin's face, then returned in a flush. His smile was gone now, replaced by something naked and calculating. You're mistaken, he said too quickly. Walter shook his head once. I'm not. Daniel felt the shift, the air changing pressure, the truth surfacing like a current. Kevin's gaze darted, recalculating, the polite mask abandoned. He looked at Daniel, then at Rex, then back at Walter and Margaret. The room held. "We're done here," Daniel said, calm and immovable. Kevin gathered himself, straightening his coat. "This isn't over," he said, backing toward the door. Walter did not respond. He simply held Margaret, his presence a promise he had learned too late to make. Kevin left without another word. The door closed. The apartment breathed again. The apartment felt smaller after Kevin left, as if his presence had pulled the walls inward and his absence left them trembling. Daniel locked the door, slid the deadbolt into place, and stood there for a moment with his back against the wood. Rex sat at his feet, 12 years old now, muzzle dusted with gray, amber eyes still sharp. The dog's body slowly relaxed, the tension draining the way it always did after a threat passed. Only then did Daniel turn back to the room. Margaret was crying quietly, not the sharp sobs of panic, but something deeper and more exhausted. Walter sat beside her, one arm firm around her shoulders, his other hand holding hers with a steadiness born of decades. His face looked carved from stone, deep lines catching the lamplight, his eyes dark and awake in a way Daniel had only seen once before, on soldiers who had decided they were done being afraid. "I should have known," Walter said at last. His voice was low, controlled, but something underneath it was splintering. "He didn't come for us. He came for the money." Daniel pulled a chair closer and sat, elbows on his knees. He hesitated only a second before speaking. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Before he showed up, I started recording." Walter looked up sharply. Margaret blinked, confused for a moment, then focused. "Recording?" Daniel nodded. "Old habit. Army taught me to document anything that might turn hostile. I turned it on when he walked in." Silence followed, heavy but not hostile. Walter studied Daniel's face, the scar near his temple, the rigid set of his jaw that never quite softened. "You were protecting us," Walter said. "Yes," Daniel replied simply. Margaret's breathing slowed. She wiped her eyes with the edge of her sleeve, and then, unexpectedly, her expression cleared. It wasn't gradual. It was as if a curtain lifted. She sat up straighter, her shoulders squaring, her gaze sharpening. Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. "He sold the house on a Tuesday," Margaret said suddenly. Her voice was steady, precise. "I remember because I had choir rehearsal that morning. I asked him why the realtor kept calling. Kevin told me not to worry, that it was paperwork, that Walter had agreed." She turned to her husband. "You hadn't agreed. You were in the garage fixing the door." Walter's hand tightened around hers. "That's right." Margaret continued, words flowing now, unstoppable. "I didn't sign anything knowingly. He said it was refinancing. He pointed where to initial. I trusted him." She looked at Daniel, eyes bright with painful clarity. "Then he told us to pack light, just essentials. He said we'd be staying temporarily." Daniel felt his chest tighten. Rex shifted closer to Margaret's knees, resting his head there, instinctively grounding her. "And the bus," Margaret said. "He told us to wait inside, but the station closed. We sat outside. It was cold. Walter gave me his coat." Her voice cracked, then steadied again. "Kevin called at dawn. He said he couldn't do this anymore, that we were too much." The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the heater. Daniel knew, with absolute certainty, that every word was being captured on his phone, time-stamped, immutable. Walter closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something had settled. "That's enough," he said. "That's the truth." A sharp knock broke the moment. Daniel's head snapped up, every muscle tensing. Rex was already on his feet, low and alert. Daniel moved to the door, checking the peephole. A man stood in the hallway, early 50s, tall, wearing a charcoal overcoat. His hair was silver at the sides, his face narrow, lips pressed thin in habitual disapproval. Beside him stood Kevin, flushed and rigid, his earlier composure gone. "Daniel Carter?" the man asked when the door opened a fraction. "I'm Thomas Green, Mr. Morris's attorney." Green's eyes were cool, appraising. "We need to de-escalate," he said. "This situation carries significant legal exposure for everyone involved." Kevin broke in, voice sharp. "They're manipulating her. You heard it." Daniel didn't respond. He simply held up his phone. "Everything tonight is recorded," he said, "including what you said earlier, Kevin." "About the money." Kevin froze. Green's expression changed, subtly, but decisively. He turned his head slightly toward Kevin. "You didn't tell me that," he said quietly. Kevin's control snapped. "I needed cash," he burst out. "The deal fell through. The house was sitting there. It was supposed to be temporary." The words hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Margaret looked at her son with a calm that was more devastating than anger. "You needed money," she said. "So you left us in the cold." Green exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. "I'm advising my client to stop speaking immediately," he said, "and to reconsider his position." Walter stood, spine straight, voice ironclad. "You don't speak for us," he said. "Not anymore." Green hesitated, then nodded once. "Given the circumstances," he said, "I recommend a pause. We will review potential criminal and civil implications." Kevin stared around the room, at the recording phone, at his parents, at the dog blocking his path. For the first time, fear crossed his face. Not fear of loss, but fear of consequence. "This isn't over," he muttered. Daniel met his gaze without blinking. "It is," he said. "You just don't see it yet." Kevin turned away. Green followed, already dialing his phone. The door closed again, softer this time. Margaret sagged back into the couch, the clarity fading as quickly as it had come. She looked at Daniel, confused but calmer. "Did I say too much?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "You said exactly enough." Walter reached for her hand, tears finally breaking free. "Everything he tried to control," he said softly. "It's slipping away." Daniel glanced down at Rex, who sat calmly, mission complete. For the first time since the bus station, Daniel felt the weight shift. Not gone, but lighter. Winter loosened its grip, slowly, like a fist that didn't want to let go. In the days after Kevin left, the apartment settled into a new rhythm, not quiet, but steady. Daniel moved through his routines with the same discipline he'd learned in uniform, but something inside him had shifted. The mission was no longer temporary. It was personal. Walter and Margaret stayed. At first it was framed that way, for now. Daniel helped Walter contact Adult Protective Services, sitting beside him at the kitchen table while the old man spoke into the phone with a voice that no longer shook. Papers followed, interviews, A social worker named Lisa Hernandez arrived one afternoon, a woman in her early 40s with dark hair pulled into a practical bun, soft brown eyes behind square glasses, and the calm, patient manner of someone who had seen too much and learned not to rush pain. She listened more than she spoke, nodded when Walter explained, and gently repeated questions to Margaret without ever correcting her. When she left, she squeezed Daniel's arm and said quietly, "You did the right thing." A new lawyer followed, one recommended through the Veterans Network. His name was Michael Barnes, late 50s, thick gray beard trimmed short, shoulders rounded from years hunched over desks and court files. He spoke plainly, without flourish, and when he looked at Kevin's case summary, his mouth tightened in a way Daniel recognized. "This isn't complicated," Barnes said. "It's ugly, but it's clear." While the legal wheels turned, life filled the spaces between. Walter took over small repairs around the apartment, fixing the loose cabinet hinge Daniel had ignored for years, oiling a squeaky door, straightening things that didn't strictly need it. He moved slower than he used to, but with purpose. Each finished task seemed to restore a piece of him. "Hands remember," he told Daniel once, smiling faintly, "even when the world doesn't." Margaret drifted through good days and foggy ones. Some mornings she woke sharp, asking what day it was, humming softly as she helped set the table. Other days she grew quiet, eyes searching rooms like they were unfamiliar cities. Daniel learned not to correct her, not to pull her back too hard. When she asked where Kevin was, Walter answered gently. When she asked where home was, Daniel simply said, "You're safe." And that seemed to be enough. Rex adapted without effort. The old German shepherd resumed a role he knew by heart, watchful, calm, always nearby. He slept outside Walter and Margaret's room at night, head resting on his paws, breathing slow and even. No threats now. No gunfire. Just family. Daniel noticed how Margaret relaxed whenever Rex leaned against her legs, how her hands instinctively found the thick fur at his neck. Protection without violence. Loyalty without command. Months passed. Spring came. Then summer. The apartment grew fuller, not with noise, but with presence. Daniel still woke early, still ran in the mornings, with Rex trotting beside him, joints stiff but determined. Walter sometimes waited by the window, coffee in hand, nodding when they returned. Margaret waved, always smiling, even when she wasn't sure why. By the time winter returned, the paperwork was finished. Kevin stayed gone. The house Daniel lived in was no longer his alone, and no one ever said it out loud, but the decision had already been made. Walter and Margaret weren't guests. They were home. Christmas came again, quieter than the year before, but warmer. Snow dusted the sidewalks outside. Daniel brought home a small tree, imperfect and slightly crooked, and Walter helped him set it upright. Margaret watched from the couch, her eyes lighting up. "Oh," she said softly, "that's lovely." They exchanged simple gifts: socks, a scarf, a new blanket. Daniel didn't need much. Neither did Walter. Margaret unwrapped each present slowly, reverently, as if the act itself mattered more than what was inside. Later that evening, as the lights glowed softly and Rex lay stretched out near the heater, Margaret wandered toward the hallway. She paused in front of Daniel, studying his face with gentle concentration. He waited, heart strangely tight. She tilted her head. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't remember your name." Daniel swallowed. He crouched slightly so they were eye level. "That's okay," he said. "You don't have to." Margaret looked past him, then down at Rex, who lifted his head and wagged his tail once. Her expression softened into something pure and unmistakable. She reached out, resting her hand on Daniel's shoulder, her touch light but certain. "You're home," she said. "You feel like home." Daniel didn't speak. He couldn't. Walter watched from the table, eyes wet but peaceful, understanding something deeper than words. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees. Inside, the apartment held. Rex sighed, content. And Daniel, who had survived wars and loss and years of silence, finally understood that family wasn't who stayed because they had to. It was who stayed because they chose to. Some miracles don't arrive with thunder. They arrive quietly, when someone chooses to stop, to care, to stay. God often works this way, not by erasing pain, but by placing love into ordinary hands. In our daily lives, we all pass someone sitting on a cold bench. We may not save the world, but we can choose not to walk away. And that choice may be the miracle someone prayed for. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and guide your heart. If this story touched you, share it, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories of faith and hope. May peace be with you, always.